I'm Jud Subar. I'm here with Talking Torah and Tzedek, and today we have Professor Arlene Kanter. She is a professor of law at Syracuse University, as well as the director of the Syracuse College of Law's Disability Law and Policy Program, and the faculty director of international programs at Syracuse College of Law. Good afternoon, Professor Kanter.
Good afternoon, Jud.
You focus your work on disability rights and disability law. How did you get interested or involved in that area?
Well, let's see. Growing up, I've known people with disabilities all my life, within my family and friends growing up. As a child, I remember volunteering at an institution nearby during the summers for kids who were sent away to live there, kids with disabilities. They looked different from me, and they didn't get to go home at night. And I really kind of always wondered about that. Why did they have to live in an institution when I got to go home around the corner? Just because they acted differently, they looked differently, they seemed like kids, like me. And frankly, it was the time of the civil rights movement, and I'm sure I didn't frame it in those terms, but as my parents relayed to me later, it always bothered me that those children who were labeled as disabled didn't get to go home at night. And to me, that became a civil rights issue.
I'm sure you've worked on lots of different disability rights issues over the years. What would you say are the disability rights issues that need the most public attention these days? And obviously, we're living in a time of a pandemic, so you might think about it in those terms. We're also living at a time when public attention on issues of racial justice has been heightened. So you might look at it that way also. But I guess I'm asking a broader question. What might have the focal issues been that were on your mind, say, 6 months ago?
Right. Well, to me, frankly, the issues are not that different than they are today. Today, we're in a crisis when 16% or more of the people who are dying of COVID have a disability. I think people with disabilities right now are dying maybe 2 to 3 times more than people without disabilities. And this people who are living in group homes, congregate care facilities or institutions, are dying at 4 times greater rate. That has been my issue really since I began working in this field, and certainly 6 months ago as well. My first job in Washington, D.C. as a disability rights lawyer was helping people leave St. Elizabeth Hospital who wanted to live in the community. And frankly, it boggles my mind that now, 25, 30 years later, we still segregate people in institutions and congregate living facilities on the basis of their disability, when they could live in the community if they got the supports they needed. So 6 months ago, 30 years ago, yesterday, I do not understand why we as a society continue to segregate people. You know, out of sight, out of mind may be easy for some people, but not for people with disabilities or even their families who have to live apart from them. So I'd say that's one of the issues. People with disabilities are dying, and that has been the case for centuries. I'd like to think that by the next generation that won't happen anymore, but I'm not overly optimistic. It's tragic. The other tragedy, I think, that I'd like to raise, and I think it's probably on your mind as well, relates to the issue of people dying at the hands of police. And that also has been an issue 6 months ago, 30 years ago, and now most recently with the death of Mr. Floyd. They estimate, what I've read, is at least 50% of people who die at the hands of police have a disability. And clearly, it's tragic and unacceptable. George Floyd had, I guess, sickle cell anemia trait and a heart condition. Eric Garner, who died at the age of 43, had asthma, diabetes, and a heart condition. He was killed by police in a chokehold. Freddie Gray, 25, had a developmental disability as a result of lead exposure when he was a child. And he died in the back of a police van, and Tanisha Anderson died in the midst of a mental health crisis in front of her own home. So not only am I concerned about people being segregated, people with disabilities, who are people like us, segregated, right? And separated in group homes, out of sight, out of mind, where they can be hurt, but within our communities, where people are sometimes victimized because of their disability. The list goes on, And I'd say more than 78 or 80% of people who are homeless or in our prisons today, I estimate about 50% have a disability. And do they really need to be there? Could they live in the community with supports? And I think a lot, Jud, about why this is the case. I think there are many reasons that we can't go into today. But I think one of the largest reasons for me is that we seem to blame homelessness, we seem to blame people with disabilities, whether they're homeless or not, for their own situation. We seem to characterize them, particularly people of color, as threatening or out of control or just unable to fit in. And I think of the most insensitive among us, including our own president, even mock them. And until we get to the point where those actions and conduct are unacceptable, and we realize that people with disabilities are kind of just like us, we're going to have challenges. We're going to continue to have challenges.
You've been talking about how we as a society view people with disabilities and treat people with disabilities. I know you've had an opportunity as an academic and as an activist to work in multiple societies. You've done work in the United States, of course, but you've worked and taught in Israel on a Fulbright scholarship, on a Lady Davis fellowship. Can you tell us about any similarities or comparisons that you've thought about between disability rights in Israel and in the United States?
Yeah, another issue I think a lot about, as you mentioned, I spent a lot of time in Israel. I taught law students there. I also work with a disability rights organization called Bizchut, which is the only disability rights organization in Israel. And maybe I'll just spend a minute thinking about or sharing with you what I've recently thought about, which are the similarities and the differences. Clearly, in both countries and in all countries, disability is not just a civil rights issue, which it is, or a social justice issue, which it is, but it's also an issue that affects all of us. Throughout the world, the largest minority are people with disabilities. 2 billion people. In the United States, about 20%, and in Israel, about the same. So a significant portion of the world population, and in our country's population, Israel and the United States, there are people with disabilities. And I like to give the example that, who's a person with a disability? My mother, who recently passed away, had hearing aids. She never identified herself as a woman with a disability or hearing impairment. She was old, right? And so clearly there are people who are even not within the numbers that we count, who may be considered by society as disabled. And what do we do with and for them? Well, in the United States, we've made a lot of progress with the Americans with Disabilities Act, with inclusive education. We're not there yet. We have a long way to go. And in Israel, I have to say, it's disappointing because on one hand, there's a lot of progressive recognition of rights and inclusion, as there should be under Jewish law, which maybe we'll get to as well. And on the other hand, whenever I go, there's more work than I can handle trying to support the advocates and family members and people with disabilities to work for greater inclusion. I wrote an op-ed the last time I was there, a year ago last summer, for the Jerusalem Post about the lack of inclusion in public schools in Israel. The Ministry of Education had proposed a budget that basically supported the continuation of separate and inferior schools. When I go, I'm also working with groups that are trying to develop community supportive group homes for people with disabilities. In fact, I just read last month's Hadassah magazine and was excited to read an interview with Judy Heumann, who's an activist here in this country with whom I've worked all around the world for disability rights. But in that same Hadassah magazine, there was a feature of 3 segregated programs that serve people with disabilities in Israel. And that's not the model. That's not where we're headed. The UN has said that people with disabilities have a right to live like everyone else with supports. And Israel is one of the biggest offenders of that principle by continuing to throw a lot of money and effort behind separate facilities for people with disabilities. So as I reflect on the differences and similarities, I realize too that here in the United States and in Israel, the LGBTQ community has made a lot of strides in terms of equality. We now have laws that recognize marriage in some cases, in some states. And yet for people with disabilities, we also have laws, but not yet the complete recognition of their rights as people. And I really try to spend I spend a lot of time talking about this with my students and thinking, what are those barriers? Why are people so afraid to include people with disabilities in our lives, when in fact we are people with disabilities, right? And we can all become disabled at any moment. So is it fear? Is it prejudice? I'm not sure. I think it's all of that. But with our progress that we've made in the United States as in Israel, there's still so much work to be done. So I'm happy to share kind of this time with you, talking about kind of the obligations of the Jewish community, because I think we can also do a lot more.
You mentioned the relevance of Jewish law to this conversation. How do you see the process of thinking about Jewish law fitting into the work that you do?
Right. So first of all, I'm going to say I'm a law professor, not a scholar of Jewish law or Jewish studies. I'm married to one, but by osmosis, it hasn't got there completely. But I think that for me personally, and for many people I've met, it's our Jewish upbringing, our familiarity with Jewish texts, and our culture and our peoplehood that has motivated a lot of us to go into kind of public interest law generally and disability rights in particular. I remember giving a talk a few years back, actually, when I was asked how Judaism kind of informs my work. And I spent some time trying to look at the sources and look in the text. And I don't have to tell this audience, perhaps, but there are many of them, from Deuteronomy, justice, justice, thou shalt pursue, which I have on my wall here in my office at home. Judaism teaches us to do justice, and not justice only for us, but also for the other, right? Love your neighbors yourself. Leave the gleanings of your harvest, right? For the poor and the stranger. Or Isaiah said that God would not listen to prayers, right? Until we began to devote ourselves to justice, the wronged, the orphan, etc. Open thy mouth for the dumb and plead the cause of the poor and the needy, I think there is in Proverbs. And perhaps the most apropos, and one that I even talk about with some of my American non-Jewish law students, what the phrase, thou shalt not curse the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind means. I know there's a lot of interpretation within our tradition that talks about that's kind of metaphorical, right? Don't get bad business advice, don't get bad advice, I've studied. But I also like to see what the words say, quite literally, and that we maybe do have an obligation to ease the way for all of us. And for me, it's quite heartfelt. It's not just being paternal or maternal trying to take care of someone. That's not what it's about. It's about how can we let others live their lives in a dignified way. And to the extent that I can move a little rock sometimes, that's giving someone else the option to exercise their choices about their lives. It's not what I want to do for them. It's what I can do with them. And to me, that's the basis of Tikkun Olam. It's the basis of Judaism. And it's really, I think, helped me when I get kind of depressed and disillusioned and frustrated at some of the policies, especially in the recent couple of years.
Sorry if this next question maybe is even a little bit more depressing, but I'd like to get just a little bit more specific and focused, if I might. One of the issues that so many of us across the world have been thinking a lot about over the last couple of weeks in particular has to do with criminal justice, a whole host of criminal justice issues that arise particularly with regard to racial justice. But in connection with disability rights, what do you see the challenges being in connection with criminal justice?
Well, I mean, I think I mentioned that all of the people who are being killed, many of the people killed by the police recently have had disabilities. And estimates are that I think it's more than 50%, I mentioned, of people in prisons and jails have a disability. I think that the ableism, as we call it, discrimination based on disability, permeates the justice system, from who gets arrested, who gets convicted, and who ends up in prison. I'm not a criminal rights lawyer or a criminal justice lawyer, but it affects not just the stigma attaching to criminal records, which then follows people with disabilities, but even conditions within prisons. I've been involved in some cases, and here in our local legal services office in our law school clinic, they've advocated for the rights of people who are deaf or blind, for example, in prison, that they can get access to services. There were policies in New York State for a while where they actually put people who were deaf in solitary confinement, people who were wheelchairs in solitary confinement. Why? Not because they were more dangerous, but because it was easier for the system to deal with them when they were alone in this separate facility. Again, separation seems to be the default in many cases. So criminal justice and disability obviously are an important issues that must be looked at in tandem. And generally, I have to say, disability doesn't stand on its own, right? You've heard the term, I'm sure, intersectionality. So a person is not only disabled, right? I'm not just a woman or a law professor or a Jewish woman. I'm a mother, I'm a wife, someone who likes to read. I have other qualities and abilities and limits and weaknesses. And the identity of individuals, right, of people with disabilities is multifaceted and intersectional. And a project in which I've been involved in now for years was just trying to raise awareness, for example, about violence against women with disabilities in all communities. And it happens, and yet the women's community often had not known how to address women with disabilities, and when they open shelters, they're not accessible. And the disability rights community had not really focused on the unique and sometimes disastrous experiences of women with disabilities who experience violence. So criminal justice and violence generally and people with disabilities, we have to take what I say to be an intersectional approach. It's not just looking at a person with a disability, it's within the context of their identity as well as their culture.
You've been talking some about raising awareness with regard to a number of the issues that you've been addressing. A lot of these issues, as you said earlier, are things that have certainly been on your mind for a long time and that you think should be on everyone's mind, maybe all the time. But as we know, the public tends to have a short attention span. Today, the issue is maybe definable in one sense as criminal justice with regard to racial justice, even though so many of the points that you're making are much broader than that, have to do with other things. Tomorrow, the issue might be something else that's in the headlines. What do you think we can do as a society to keep public attention focused where it needs to be focused?
I wish I knew. As I said, if we look at the example of the LGBTQ community, they were pretty successful in raising awareness and resulting in change. The disability rights community has been at work at this for many years. The original Civil Rights Act in the United States from 1964 was to include, for example, a provision about disability that Hubert Humphrey proposed, and it wasn't accepted. And then we couldn't have a law again until the ADA in 1990. And I'm encouraged by the fact that the United Nations adopted a treaty on the rights of people with disabilities in 2006, and that has been adopted now in many countries. But I think that's a question of changing of attitudes, not just laws. As I said, until we really appreciate that people with disabilities are us, right? That they are among us, they are in our families, they are our neighbors, they're in our schools and workplaces, and that they, like all of us, have a right to dignity and to live a life where they can make choices for themselves. It's not going to change that much. And when it does get in the news, it's those horrific examples of, people with disabilities who may be killed by police or who now are dying of COVID. And it breaks my heart, I think we'd agree, that it takes tragedies to bring public attention to issues. But maybe now's the time. Maybe we are at a time in our history where things have been so divided and where the United States has lost enormous international prestige and respect, that we have to look at ourselves a little bit as a country to see where we want to go. And I hope in that process, where we go will be with people with disabilities, because they are us. and maybe there'll be hope for change. I have to say, I do get to see reasons for optimism every day I go to Syracuse University College of Law, which I'm not going these days, but I hope to return soon. And that's in the face and listen to the words of my students. It really, they inspire me. What can I say? I started our program in disability law 15 years ago as the first program in the country, trying to develop a curriculum for students who want to become disability rights lawyers, students with and without disabilities. We actively recruit students with disabilities. I've had students who can't speak, who can't walk the way you and I do. They talk, they walk, they may think, they may act, they may write differently than the norm, but they are now practicing disability rights or other kinds of lawyers. And that gives me a lot of reason, actually, for optimism. They will not be satisfied sitting in the back. They will not be satisfied being excluded. They grew up at a time when they could go to law school, when they are now advocating for rights for themselves and others. And I just hope we keep producing more and more of them around the world. That's why I go to Israel to teach as well, I'll be honest, to try to instill in lawyers as a profession the obligation to be open and to develop the expertise of people with different skills and different ideas and different way of doing things, because that's really what a disability inclusion is about, I think.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your optimism, sharing your thoughts, and sharing your academic work and your activism with us and with the whole world. Thank you so much.